The pale remark was not a beautiful ship. Cal Morrow had accepted this the way a person accepts a recurring dream, not with enthusiasm, but with the particular resignation of someone who has stopped expecting the situation to improve on its own. She was a Drantec-class mid-haul freighter, which was the manufacturer's way of saying she was large enough to carry serious cargo and small enough that no one would ever write anything about her. Her hull was the color of old industrial primer, because at some point in her operating history, someone had repainted her in old industrial primer, and then apparently lost interest before finishing. One of her portside running lights had been flickering for 3 months. Cal had replaced the relay twice. The light had reviewed his work and flickered anyway. "Pell," he said from the pilot's seat, holding a protein bar that claimed to be zesty citrus and was not. "Run me the fuel consumption differential on the last 2 legs." "The differential is 4.3% above projected," Pell said. Pell's voice had been designed to be neutral and informative, and it had succeeded so completely that 11 years of working alongside it had left Cal genuinely uncertain whether he found it comforting or whether he had simply stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the sound of your own refrigerator. "This is consistent with the variance I flagged in the secondary thrust calibration 7 weeks ago." "You flagged it." "I logged it in the maintenance queue." "That is not the same as flagging it." "I have reconsidered my position on this and maintain that it is." Cal finished the protein bar, considered the wrapper for a moment as though it owed him something, and filed it in the disposal slot. Outside the viewport, unclaimed space did what unclaimed space always did, which was nothing, elaborately and in all directions. There were regions of the transit map that the commercial routing authorities marked with the cartographic equivalent of a shrug. Not dangerous, exactly, not contested, just unincorporated in the specific way of places that nobody has bothered to want yet. Cal passed through them regularly. They were good for saving fuel on routing arcs and bad for everything else, including conversation, scenery, and the ambient sense that the universe contained other people who were currently doing things. It was Pell who caught the beacon. Cal had not been expecting a beacon because he had not been expecting anything, which was the standard operating condition of 11 years in cargo transit. "Distress signal," Pell said. "Class IV, automated loop. Origin bearing is 17 degrees off our current heading. The signal has been active for approximately." A pause that Cal had learned to read as Pell accessing a secondary database. 61 hours. Cal looked up from the fuel consumption report he had been reading with the focused attention of a man trying to care about something he did not care about. 61 hours and nobody's answered it. "We are in unclaimed space. There is no one to answer it." "There's us." "There is us," Pell agreed, with the tone of an entity that had long since stopped expecting this observation to lead anywhere other than where it was about to lead. Cal debated with himself. He was good at this. It was one of his more consistent skills, the internal negotiation between the part of him that understood the operational logic of staying en route, and the part of him that had, apparently, been assembled from components that made leaving things alone structurally difficult. He gave it 4 minutes. He had timed himself before, in earlier years, and 4 minutes was approximately how long it took for the outcome of the debate to become obvious, the remaining time being devoted to performing due diligence on a conclusion he had already reached. "Adjust heading," he said. 17 degrees, Pell confirmed, without any inflection that suggested surprise, because Pell had learned in its own way not to invest in surprise. The ship on the scan was a Fulchet 7 mid-range hauler, which was the kind of vessel that attracted the kind of work that did not appear on public freight exchanges. She was sitting dead in space with her drives offline and her running lights down, which gave her the specific quality of something pretending not to be there, an effect she somewhat undermined by broadcasting a distress beacon. Her hull markings had been removed with an industrial solvent that had done an aggressive job. Not just the registration codes, but the manufacturer's serial stamps, the dock authority stickers, everything that would allow a transit system to ask where she came from and receive an honest answer. Can you get me anything on the manifest? The manifest is corrupted deliberately. How can you tell it's deliberate? Because the corruption is consistent and patterned, which is what deliberate corruption looks like, as opposed to system failure corruption, which is inconsistent and reflects the specific component that failed. I have explained this distinction to you previously. I retain information on a needs basis. I am aware of this. Cal suited up in the equipment bay, pulling on the environmental suit he used for external inspections and loading dock work, which was rated for vacuum and moderate radiation, and absolutely nothing else. It was the color of faded orange, and had a scratch on the helmet visor from an incident involving a poorly secured crate of industrial fasteners that he did not enjoy remembering. He checked his toolkit. Standard set, atmospheric tester, handheld scanner, and the bolt cutters he carried because bolt cutters solved, conservatively, 40% of all physical problems a cargo hauler encountered in a working week. The airlock between the two ships engaged with the hydraulic certainty of a system that had performed this operation enough times to have stopped caring about the drama of it. Cal stepped through. The other ship's interior was dark in the way of systems running on minimal power, not dead, but conserving, stretched thin. The air recyclers were audible, laboring. It smelled of recycled atmosphere and something underneath it that he couldn't name and didn't like. He found the hold on the third door. She was inside, and she was alive, and she was not quite human, and she was locked in a restraint frame wearing a collar that his scanner could not identify, and his instincts had already decided it did not like. The climate regulation components Cal was hauling to Meridian Industrial Moon 7 were, according to their shipping manifest, sensitive to vibrational interference above 0.4 Hz, which meant he spent the first 18 hours of the return leg running the Pale remark at reduced engine output, while Pell recalculated their arrival window with the quiet satisfaction of an AI that had suggested this exact approach 3 days ago and had not been listened to. "We'll be 4 hours late," Cal said. 6 hours and 17 minutes late, Pell corrected. "I said 4. You said 4, I said 6:17. These are different numbers." "I'm aware they're different numbers." "Then I want to confirm we have the same understanding of the situation." Cal leaned back in the pilot's seat and looked at the cargo hold feed on his secondary display, where 17 crates of climate regulators sat in their restraint webbing being carefully not vibrated, and thought about the fact that somewhere behind him, at a refugee processing station, he had already filed out of his mental active directory. A woman whose collar he had cut off with bolt cutters was eating institutional food and filling out forms that would ask her questions she might not yet be ready to answer. He thought about this for approximately 40 seconds, and then opened his novel about the retired terraforming engineer on the colony ship. Because the retired terraforming engineer's problems were bounded and solvable, and did not require him to examine the arithmetic of his own decisions. He read 11 pages. Then he put the novel down and thought about the scanner readings he'd taken in the hold, the ones calibrated for human biology that had clearly been missing a significant percentage of what they should have been finding. He thought about the collar. He thought about the specific category of person who installs a neural suppression device on someone and then leaves them in a hold with the air recyclers on minimum. "Pell," he said, "what's the processing success rate at Vethon Station for non-standard species applications?" There was a pause that, from Pell, represented genuine database consultation rather than dramatic effect. 61% achieve resettlement within 90 days. The remaining 39% are transferred to secondary holding pending species verification. Secondary holding. It is described in the station documentation as a transitional facility. What does it actually look like? The documentation, does not include visual records of the interior. Cal thought about this. Then he thought about the fact that he had not left his contact information, which had seemed like intelligent self-preservation at the time, and was beginning to feel, in the specific way of decisions that age badly, like something else. He picked up his novel again. He read 2 more pages. He put it back down. Pell, is there a way to file an anonymous welfare inquiry with Vethon Station Processing? Yes. The inquiry would be logged, but the origin registry would be masked. File 1. Filed. Do you want me to note that you are asking this so that I can remind you of it when you tell yourself you left without involvement? I want you to note, Cal said, that you are increasingly difficult to work with. I have made no changes to my operating parameters. He delivered the climate regulators 6 hours and 19 minutes late, which was close enough to Pell's estimate that he did not comment on the discrepancy, because some victories were not worth the cost of acknowledging them. The receiving coordinator on Meridian Industrial Moon 7 was a broad man named Ostrev, who wore the expression of someone who had spent 20 years discovering that the universe consistently failed to meet his scheduling expectations, and who had therefore arrived at a state of philosophical acceptance, so complete it had begun to resemble contentment. 6 hours late, Ostrev said, marking his clipboard. Sensitive cargo, Cal said. Vibrational compliance. Ostrev made the sound of a man who had heard every variant of this sentence. You're not the worst this week. High praise. Don't push it. The partial return load was 14 units of decommissioned atmospheric sampling equipment going back to a manufacturer for refurbishment, which were not sensitive to vibration, not sensitive to temperature variance, and not sensitive to anything except the general indignity of being considered used goods, which Cal could not help with. He filed his routing plan, confirmed his transit corridor registration, and pointed the pale remark back into the dark with the settled feeling of a man whose life has returned, through the reliable mechanics of work and paperwork, to its correct shape. He was 4 hours out, eating a protein bar that the packaging called garden herb, and that tasted like someone had described herbs to a chemist over a bad comm connection, when Pell interrupted the engine diagnostic. There are vessels on long-range scan, Pell said. Cargo or transit? Neither. A pause. Military configuration, 17 units. Registry is not unregistered, it exists. It simply does not appear in any database I have access to. Cal set down the protein bar. That's a meaningful distinction. I thought you would find it so. How big? Pell told him. Cal looked at the pilot viewport, at the thoroughly average stars in the thoroughly average transit corridor, and had the specific thought of a man understanding, in real time, that his week had not actually closed when he filed the delay report. The fleet on the scan was not a coincidence. Coincidences did not have 17 ships and unknown registries, and the kind of deliberate, unhurried positioning that communicated, across any cultural distance, that the positioning was intentional. They're hailing us, Pell said. Of course they are. Do you want me to answer? Cal looked at the scan. He looked at the protein bar. He thought about bolt cutters and the arithmetic of his own decisions, and the specific way that some weeks turn out to be one long week in disguise. Answer it, he said. The escort ships did not ask him how he was doing. They did not offer travel time estimates or suggest he make himself comfortable. They bracketed the pale remark on 3 sides with the professional efficiency of a system that had performed this maneuver enough times to have stopped finding it interesting. And they held their positions with a steadiness that made his own ship's minor navigational drift feel like a personal failing. Cal flew where they pointed him. This seemed, given the available options, like the correct approach. Pell, he said, watching the flagship grow on the approach display from a shape into an architecture. If someone were to ask at a later point whether I complied voluntarily, what would you say? I would say that you reduced speed immediately upon being hailed, and offered no resistance of any kind. Good. I would also note that resistance was not physically viable given the force differential, which provides context for the compliance. But I'd prefer you leave that part out. I will include it anyway for accuracy. The flagship's docking bay opened the way important doors open, without urgency, without ceremony, with the absolute confidence of a thing that has never once considered the possibility that it might need to hurry. The interior it revealed was enormous in the way that reframed the word, the kind of enormous that made Cal briefly recalibrate what enormous meant, and then recalibrate again. The pale remark settled onto the deck plating, and the landing struts engaged and the bay sealed behind him, and Cal sat in the sudden quiet of a powered-down ship, and did the thing he always did when a situation had outpaced his preparation, which was to take a slow inventory of what he actually knew. He knew he had cut a collar off a woman in a hold. He knew she had not been human in the precise technical sense. He knew 17 warships had found him in a transit corridor where 17 warships had no obvious reason to be. He knew these facts were connected because the universe was not, in his experience, in the business of generating unrelated 17 warship encounters. Beyond this, his inventory was thin. He also knew that his toolkit was still aboard, including the bolt cutters, and he briefly entertained the comfort of this, before acknowledging that there was no version of the immediate future in which bolt cutters were the relevant tool. The honor guard, he had decided in the corridor that it was an honor guard rather than an armed escort, on the grounds that this interpretation was marginally less alarming, and he was rationing his alarm, led him through the flagship's interior with the pacing of people who knew exactly where they were going and were accustomed to others falling into step. The corridors were designed for a species that solved the same locomotion problem as humans from a slightly different set of first principles. Everything was calibrated 1 degree off from comfortable. The lighting hit the spectrum at the edges of familiar. It was the interior design equivalent of a word in your own language pronounced with an accent you can't quite place. The chamber they brought him to was not what stories had prepared him for. There was no throne. There was a command table with active display surfaces showing information he couldn't read, and tactical architecture built into the walls in ways his eye understood as functional without being able to parse the specifics, and viewports that opened onto the dark with the unself-conscious confidence of people who had spent enough time in space to stop finding it dramatic. And there was a woman standing at the center of it, and it was her. And it was not the version of her he had last seen walking through refugee processing intake with a paper bag. Cal had a thought that arrived with the clarity of genuine surprise. The iridescent patterns beneath her skin were moving. At Vethon Station they had been barely visible, dull and slow, the way a fire looks when it's been banked too long and starved of air. Now they ran in full expression down her forearms and her throat, deliberate and articulate, a calligraphy the body was writing in real time. The crown was structural rather than decorative, integrated with ceremonial armor in a way that made the whole assembly read as a single coherent argument about what she was. She looked like a person who had been interrupted in the middle of being very important and had returned to it without missing a step. She looked, Cal thought, extremely unlike someone who had recently accepted a refugee station intake voucher. She spoke first, which he was grateful for, because he had not yet identified an appropriate opening. Her trade standard was precise and carried the cadence of a language learned completely rather than absorbed, every word selected, none of them wasted. She told him her name. She told him her title. She told him that her disappearance had triggered a sector-wide emergency, that search assets had been pulled from 3 active military theaters, that the political consequences were still being managed by people who were very tired. She told him that under the laws of the Keth Dominion, the person who restores the freedom of a sovereign holds a claim against the crown, a claim called the Darkale, that supersedes political constraint, cannot be refused or delegated, and exists specifically, Because the Dominion's founders understood that ordinary people who do extraordinary things by accident deserve protection from the temptation of the powerful to forget what happened. She told him she was here to ask what he wanted. Cal absorbed all of this. It took a moment. During this moment, he was aware of the guards at the room's perimeter, of the information displays cycling through data he couldn't read, of the fact that his mouth was doing the thing it sometimes did when his brain was still loading, which was to remain open without producing any output. "I'm glad you recovered," he said. The room did not change. The displays kept cycling, but one of the officers flanking her made a very small sound that was technically a cough and was actually something else entirely, and Alithvar looked at him with the expression of a person who has prepared extensively for a conversation that has just departed from every version she prepared for. "The dark ale," she said, with the careful patience of someone choosing to proceed as though the previous response had been a reasonable one, "entitles you to name your claim. Resources, territory, political standing, military commission, formal alliance of the Dominion. What you name, within the capacity of the Crown to provide, cannot be refused." Cal looked at her. He thought about the bolt cutters. He thought about the moral position that leaving someone in a cage when you own bolt cutters is not a position he was able to hold and live with afterward. He thought about the fact that converting that into a line item felt like it changed what the thing was retroactively, the way adding a price tag to a gift reclassifies it as a transaction. "Can I think about it?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The living script moved along her collarbone in patterns he had no vocabulary for yet. "Yes," she said, "you may think about it." Somewhere at the room's perimeter, the officer coughed again. The quarters they gave him were excellent, which he found almost more disorienting than the fleet. Cal had spent 11 years sleeping in a bunk aboard the Pale Remark that was precisely long enough for him if he did not fully extend his feet, and the Keth guest quarters offered a sleeping surface that accommodated his entire body with room left over, which should have been straightforwardly pleasant, and instead felt like a philosophical challenge. He lay on it for a while. He stared at the ceiling, which was lit in that slightly wrong spectrum, warm in the frequencies his eyes weren't built to prioritize. He thought about what he wanted. The food they brought him was extraordinary, which also did not help. Every dish arrived unmarked and unfamiliar and better than it had any right to be, and he ate all of it with the focused attention of a man who has recently been eating protein bars called garden herb, and has recalibrated his standards accordingly. He found himself wishing Pell could form opinions about food, and then immediately found himself aware that this was a strange thing to wish, and that 11 years of Pell as his primary conversational companion had perhaps left some marks. He calmed the Pale Remark from the room's communication terminal, which interfaced with his ship systems through a docking protocol so seamlessly executed. It suggested the Keth had encountered and integrated a significant number of alien vessel types. Pell answered immediately because Pell did not sleep and had no other current responsibilities. "I need to think out loud," Cal said. "I am able to receive audio," Pell said. "That's what I said." "You said think out loud. This implies a social function beyond information transfer, which I want to flag as outside my optimized use case." "Noted. She's offered me anything the Crown can provide. Resources, territory, military commission, formal alliance, all of it. The dark ale, it's law. She can't refuse it." "Then you should ask for a significant amount of money," Pell said, with the serenity of an entity for whom this conclusion required no deliberation whatsoever. "I can calculate a figure that would cover operational costs for the Pale Remark for approximately 60 years, account for full hull replacement, and include a buffer for contingencies." "The contingency buffer," Cal said. "How large?" "Generous. And you think that's what I should ask for?" "It is what I would ask for if I required material resources, which I do not, being software." "What if asking for it changes what the thing was?" There was a pause. Pell's pauses were never dramatic, but this one had a quality of genuine processing to it, the real kind. "I do not understand the distinction you are drawing," it said finally, which was, Cal reflected, the most honest answer available and therefore exactly what he would have expected. He met Alithvar the following morning in the room with the viewports, which he was coming to understand was her space for conversations that required honesty rather than ceremony. She was not in the full armor. The living script moved at a pace that he was beginning to read. Not the content, he had no vocabulary for that yet, but the tempo, the way you can sense the mood of a piece of music before you understand the language of its lyrics. She sat across the low table and did not perform patience at him, which he appreciated. She simply had it. He told her what he'd been thinking. Not efficiently, because the thought did not have an efficient shape. It had the shape of something he'd been carrying without naming, and naming it aloud in a room aboard a Keth flagship to the woman whose collar he'd cut off with standard cargo equipment was a process that required the actual time it took. She listened the way people listen when they are not organizing their response while you speak. He told her that he freed her because the alternative was not freeing her, and not freeing her was not something he was built to do. He told her that this was not heroism, which implies calculation about outcomes and a decision that weighs personal cost. He told her it was closer to a reflex, the kind that operates below the level where receipts are issued. He told her that converting a reflex into an invoice felt like reaching back into the past and adding a motive that wasn't there, and that he found this troubling in a way he couldn't fully resolve. Alithvar was quiet for a moment. The living script slowed. Then she told him that the Darkale was not designed to convert his motive. It was designed to protect him from a world that would eventually notice what he had done and begin finding ways to extract value from it without his consent. She told him that the Dominion's founders wrote the law for exactly the person sitting across from her, the one who acts without accounting for payment, and is therefore the most likely to be taken advantage of afterward. The claim was not a reward, it was armor, and he could choose to wear it or not, but she wanted him to understand what he was declining if he declined. He sat with this. Through the viewport, the dark held its position, patient and enormous, full of transit corridors and unclaimed space and distress beacons that may or may not be answered depending on who happens to be passing. "There's a processing station," he said. "Vethon. It handles non-standard species applications, and it's underfunded in ways that affect outcomes for the people moving through it. 61% make it through in 90 days. The other 39 go to secondary holding, and the documentation doesn't include interior photographs, which I find to be an informative absence." Alithvar looked at him steadily. "I'd like the station funded," he said, "properly. Staff, equipment, legal resources, species-calibrated medical systems, whatever it actually needs. And I'd like it inspected by someone with authority to enforce standards on a recurring basis, by someone who cannot be managed or minimized by the station's administrative structure." He paused. "That's what I want." She was quiet long enough that he wondered whether he had made an error of some kind, whether the Darkale had minimum claim requirements, whether asking for infrastructure improvements to a refugee processing station was the galactic equivalent of the farmer who asked for grazing rights and had been puzzling legal scholars ever since. Then the living script moved in a pattern he didn't have words for yet, fast and deliberate, and she said that it would be done, fully and permanently, funded at a level that would make underfunding a structural impossibility rather than a budget line item, and inspected by a Keth Oversight Commission, with authority that no station administrator would be able to manage or minimize, because managing and minimizing a Keth Oversight Commission was not a thing that station administrators did twice. "That's all," she said, not dismissively, with something he was learning to read as genuine curiosity about the shape of a person she had not encountered the category of before. "That's enough," he said. He left the next morning. Pell had the pale remark ready, which it always did, because Pell was the most reliable entity in his operational life, and he had perhaps not said so enough. The docking bay released him without ceremony, and the fleet did not follow, and the dark opened ahead of him in all its unprofitable and available immensity. He filed his next routing plan. He confirmed his transit corridor registration. He ate the last protein bar from his supply, something called morning grain that tasted, for the first time, almost like what it claimed to be, which he suspected said more about his recalibrated baseline than about the bar. Pell, he said, as the stars arranged themselves into the familiar geometry of a working route, flag the maintenance queue for actual review. All of it. Flagged, Pell said. This is an improvement over your previous approach. Don't push it. The secondary thrust calibration still requires attention. I know. I have known this for 7 weeks. I know that too, Cal said. He set the heading. The pale remark moved through the dark with her flickering portside light, and her aging hull, and her slightly wrong fuel consumption differential. Carrying a man who had cut a collar off a stranger with bolt cutters and asked, in return, for something that would keep helping people.